I'm Kelsey Litchfield, and this is the Field Advisor Podcast, where I talk with local experts to unpack the latest agronomy information and research, giving you the knowledge to make informed decisions out in the field. Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Field Advisor. I'm Kelsey Litchfield, back with another episode today with someone who is new to the podcast, but not necessarily Field Advisor. Welcome, Matt Reardon. He is the Senior Atmospheric Scientist, or like you just said earlier, I'm the weather guy with Nutrient Ag Solutions. So welcome, Matt. Excited to have you here today. There's a lot to talk about weather-wise. Most recently, I will say we had quite a few storms this past Friday. Where I live in northern Knox County here in Illinois, we have not seen winds like that in quite a long time. I think I maybe saw 80 mile per hour winds somewhere, and it did quite a bit of damage to sheds. My roof, quite a few shingles are now missing, more than there was. Definitely tree damage. So Illinois, are they in for a severe weather season come spring?
Yeah, so our severe weather season in Illinois typically picks up this time of year. March, April, May, can last into June some years. We saw it start quickly this year. You mentioned you haven't seen wind like that for some time. I think part of the reason for that is how deep the low pressure system that came through last Friday was. It was down to about 972, 974 millibars. If we get down to about 990 millibars, you're talking pretty high winds, significant severe weather. We dropped almost 20 millibars below that with one of these, what we call bomb cyclones. And if you talk to meteorologists for any amount of time, you'll find that we find the craziest words for things. And a bombogenesis cyclone is one that drops 24 millibars in 24 hours. And this one qualified.
It kind of looked like a hurricane, but obviously not a hurricane.
Not a hurricane. In fact, these, we call them mid-latitude cyclones, low pressure systems, you might hear them called on the news. They are larger than hurricanes. They often can last longer. And they stretch damage and impacts for thousands of miles in some cases, where hurricanes, despite being large storms on their own, very powerful, are even more localized than that. So this stretch from Canada, it took dust from Lubbock all the way up into the upper peninsula of Michigan. We saw blizzard conditions on the backside of it, all the way down to severe weather, all the way to the Gulf of Mexico.
Wow. I will say, and I've heard this said before, I live in the Midwest. I'd rather deal with tornadoes than hurricanes. Probably depends on the day if you really want to deal with that. But we can start anywhere you'd like. But I just want to make note. It feels like we have more wind events. Maybe it's just my short-term memory. I don't know. It just feels like there's more windier days right now, and maybe it's that time of year, or I am constantly seeing on social media every day more red flag warnings, don't burn, things like that. And it just seems more common. Is that correct?
Yeah. Kelsey, I hear that all the time. So traveling all over the state, all over the Midwest, it's a very common trend. It feels like it's windier, especially in what we call, here's another fancy meteorological term, the equinoctial time periods, that is spring and fall, right around the equinox. And that's typically when we have the greatest temperature contrast between north and south. So you still have snowpack, and some of the satellite imagery that we saw from the storm system, if you had a close eye on the northern part of the country or even Canada, there's snow on the ground. And then we're bringing up 80 Fahrenheit temperatures into the southern portion of the country. That gradient between the two is often going to drive that wind in between. Now, to your point, have we been getting windier, let's say, on a decadal trend over the last 10, 20, 30, 40 years? Some data, the way you parse it out, it's not clear. It could be in there. The thing is, if you increase 1 mile an hour per average winds annually, that could fall in any part of the year. We're focused kind of on spring and fall, and the data is not clear there. What I can say is, in some of the last few years, we've been drier. You mentioned those red flag warnings. The winds are typically more noticeable. You're going to get those burn bans. So there could be a decadal trend. We haven't quite parsed it out in the data yet. It could be things are a little bit drier in these last few years. 2023 had an uptick in some early season drought concern. And that's around when I started hearing some of those wind comments as well.
2023 was when we had that dust storm that came across Illinois, and was a really bad event. Any worry there of more dust storms becoming more prevalent? I know they're not very common, but when you say you feel like there's more wind, and depending on the area, are we seeing more of that topsoil that's just getting blown up and blown away? I don't know.
Yeah, no, it's a good point. I can remember one in 23, like you mentioned. There was one a few years back. The year escapes me, but it caused a number of accidents. I actually knew somebody who, witnessed one of these, and they're scary. I mean, they reduce visibility quickly. If it happens when folks are out working and there's a lot of field work happening, that can sometimes churn up dust. So it's a quick time of year in terms of how quickly conditions can change. And to answer your question, unfortunately, Tuesday today, we're going to see winds pick up. If you look at the NOAA, or you go to weather.gov, you can see those red flag warnings just inching closer to Illinois, starting to cross the river there. I think this continues tomorrow with some strong winds. And unfortunately, we could increase those gusts up to 30, 40, 50 miles an hour. It wouldn't surprise me if we get that hazy, kind of ominous look in the air that we saw and woke up to on Saturday morning in one of these places, and had that dirty rain, right? That you got to go out and clean stuff off. So I think we'll see another round of that. I don't think it's going to be to the same extent that we saw on Saturday, just because this low pressure system, I mentioned the one dropping down to 974 millibars. This one is at least going to probably stay above 980 millibars, but that's still significant. I mean, that's still going to bring a lot of hazards that we'll have to talk about.
Any other comment from last Friday of those thunderstorms, or anything that farmers should be aware of from that? I know quite a bit maybe had damage.
Yeah, the biggest thing I would say, and I stressed this all day on Friday, is these late severe setups concern me more than anything. And the reason for that is, I don't know about you, but I'm going to bed at 9, 10, maybe 11 p.m. if I stay up late. And people need a way to get warnings. So have those weather radios, have your phone charged. You get the mobile alerts on your phone. They sounded multiple times in central Illinois on Friday evening. But I looked some of those alerts up. They came through at 12:20 a.m., one at 12:40 a.m. And we've had confirmed tornadoes now from the National Weather Service that came through after midnight, EF1 up to EF2 damage. That's enough to be life-threatening. And you can imagine how much more percentage of folks are asleep. You can't always rely on sirens.
Right.
You live far away. Sometimes they don't sound. That's why we test them every single month. You can't always rely on your phone if it's not charged. So have multiple ways to get warnings late at night. I can almost guarantee you this will not be the last late night severe setup that we see this year.
I was in my neck of the woods. It came through about 9:30 at night. And the way the wind was blowing, I could not hear the siren. Usually I can. I live just right on the edge of town. Usually I can, but just the way the wind was blowing, I'm like, am I hearing the siren? I don't know. But it's got on the radar. I'm like, yeah, that looks kind of nasty. You should maybe take cover. So real quick, while we're on the storm, derechos has become a more common name to farmers. I remember a couple years ago, we were sitting just outside Champaign and a derecho came through. Are these becoming more common here in the Midwest? I know I asked Trent Ford this past December, and I'm curious on your take on it.
Yeah, I think part of the kind of apparent trend is the term derecho, again, meteorological term that we now use. This kind of came about in the mid-2000s. I think there was a seminal paper in 2007 or 2008 that started to label these significant thunderstorm wind events, which in some cases brought more damage, more economic impacts, higher insurance losses than some large tornado events of the past. And we needed a way to kind of categorize them as, this isn't your typical severe thunderstorm, which, by themselves can be damaging and are notable. But these things stretch for miles. We look at them to exceed 60 to 90 miles in width. And then they have a length component as well. So you see this long swath of wind reports. And the one I think you're probably mentioning back is kind of kicked the door down on the early season drought we saw in 23. I think came through like June 26th, 27th. I remember when that came through and all the way through Indiana. And it seemed like that just opened the door finally to moisture that came in sort of right when we hit those reproductive growth stages and saved the day in 23. Whether they're becoming more common, it's hard to say because we have only started focusing and classifying them more recently. So it's hard to say, is it kind of a data artifact that now that we know what these things are, we want to call them something and keep an eye on them. And I'm glad we're doing that because we're finding conditions now, typically a little bit later in the severe season. We just talked about June, where these become more common. So early in the year, you still have wind threat, tornado threat. As we stretch into May, June, July, you hear that derecho word start to pick up a little bit. And that's because climatologically we see them pick up then. You might remember in August of 2020, the historic one that came through Iowa.
Yeah.
Again, later in summer, and that stretched wind reports all the way through central Illinois, even into parts of southern Illinois later that evening.
Yeah. Any comment on the upcoming storm this Wednesday? We're recording this on Tuesday, March 18th. I'm starting to hear some chit chat on social media about this upcoming storm. Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, this is I'll be honest, a tricky forecast. So we mentioned how strong the storm system was. We all felt that on Friday and Saturday. It brought quite a strong cold front through that helped to push that tornado outbreak down into the southeast on Saturday in the evening. We ended up seeing severe reports all the way to Pennsylvania and then New York, east of here. That cold front, with all that energy that storm had, went all the way through the Gulf of Mexico. It actually is now down into the Caribbean. And so you have cold air kind of pushing or raking all that Gulf moisture further south. And it's going to take a while to build up that moisture source that is that fuel for these severe thunderstorms, especially this time of year. So the storm that's coming in this Wednesday, it's operating on less fuel, but it's still potent in the wind and the shear department. So we kind of, when we're looking for the ingredients for severe weather, we're looking for an organized storm system. That box is checked. We have a deep low pressure system coming in, developing Tuesday and Wednesday. We look for wind shear that is turning with height, wind direction or speed changing. And the storms are going to feel that as they grow vertically. And that helps to create that spin, producing all the sorts of hazards that we follow, tornadoes included. But the third important ingredient here is the instability. So colder aloft than it is at the surface, drier aloft than it is at the surface. And that one is in question. Some of the latest model runs that have just come out here in the last 24 hours show surprisingly decent amount of moisture return, despite that Gulf still needing to recharge a bit. It's kind of like catching the last train. It pulls up a little bit of Gulf moisture right at the end. And some of the models now showing potentially some weak supercell development across really more east of I-39 or east of the line near I-55 on Wednesday afternoon before quickly pushing into Indiana. Storm Prediction Center has a slight risk out for severe weather. That's kind of level 2 out of 5, if you will. So it's about when we start to take notice, but it is conditional on that moisture coming up into Illinois just in time. So that's what I'll be keeping my eye on over the next 24 hours.
When is the not the meteorological spring? That started March 1st, but the actual spring, is that Thursday, the 20th?
I believe so.
Yeah. So speaking of spring, I know the National Weather Service usually comes out with like an outlook. What does that look like? Are they seeing more storms, more rain? I know it's so hard to predict, and sometimes those outlooks can be wrong, but maybe they'll give us some idea of what to look out for.
Yeah, I mean, it's a good point there at the end. These seasonal forecasting, just as a science, it's a difficult one. So our people, I think, just intuitively understand that the weather forecast is pretty good. I mean, we've gotten a pretty good accuracy 5-7 days out. You start stretching from 7 to 14, that accuracy and confidence predictably drops. Now, when you stretch that out to a 2-3 month forecast or even a 3 to 6 week forecast, we're talking about a different sort of target. So if I'm going to forecast the weather for this Friday, I'm talking about, is it going to be partly sunny? Are we going to get to 70 degrees or 66 degrees? We're starting to narrow down a forecast pretty closely. I might even be able to tell you that the PM looks rainier than the AM. But when we're talking about a seasonal forecast, I can't tell you any specific day. For example, in late April or early May. If you're planning a wedding or a soccer game or a picnic, you're kind of on your own up until we get inside that 14-day window. But what we have developed some skill is May going to be wetter than usual? Or is it going to be cooler or drier than usual? Now, we're not perfect at that. I mentioned it's an inexact science, but these National Weather Service forecasts, these seasonal outlooks, have demonstrated some skill at forecasting, will this planting window be wetter than usual? But I even have to put a disclaimer on that. Just because a 3-week window might be wetter than usual or even significantly wetter than usual, that doesn't mean there aren't windows. If that all comes through in a very busy weekend with high rain events, and you bring winds on that and good evaporation, you can dry out soil sufficiently with quite a bit of rain. So it's never as detailed as we want it to be, but the forecasts right now are in fact that way I just described. They're looking wetter for Illinois and then the Eastern Corn Belt as we get into April and May. It's really kind of west and south of us or southwest of us that I'm more concerned for drought developing, at least over the next kind of 30 to 60 days. And that makes sense. We just saw the dust come from Texas, came from Oklahoma and some of the wildfires there. So we know that dryness has established itself there. We're getting this kind of reflection of that in these dust storms. I think we'll see that again this week with some hazy skies and perhaps some wildfire smoke.
let's talk about that. Let's see where we are. Can you quickly recap just fall and winter and how that has impacted us right now with kind of the subsoil moisture? I want to set it up for farmers to see, because for me, I have a pretty short-term memory. I don't know. I kind of remember last fall being pretty dry. People got through harvest pretty quickly. Winter, yeah, we've had some snow, but a lot of that was fluffy stuff, probably didn't get into the ground. So I'm kind of curious, setting that up to where we are now. I did see the drought monitor the other day. Looks like it's getting a bit worse. And I know I saw your tweet yesterday. And just for people, let me share, you said the recent dryness in the Southern Plains, made apparent by this weekend's cross-country dust storm and Oklahoma wildfires, is threatening to expand further this spring. Its proximity to existing drought across the northern plains is your greatest concern for the upcoming growing season. So let's talk about that.
Well, we got to start with last fall. So I live just out on the kind of the edge of Champaign, so right near a bunch of cornfields and some small storage. And usually late at night on a wet harvest, dryers are keeping me awake, and so I know that's going to come, at the end of every year. And I don't remember any night hearing one running this past year. Now, I don't know if they disassembled the one that's near my house, but when I talk to folks, not a lot of drying last year. So it was a dry fall, dry harvest.
You're correct.
Folks were, I think, maybe even drier than they wanted to be. Mm-hmm. And that established itself as this kind of subsoil overwintered drought, if you will. We'll call it maybe a subsoil drought, where we typically are coming out of a winter and we're drilling down. I just did this outside of our office yesterday, went out there with a full meter soil sampler, and that took a lot of elbow grease to get all the way down there. And we eventually found some pretty dry soils, couldn't really get a ribbon out of them. The further and further you go down, kind of getting beneath some of these recent rainfall events. So that fall drought, believe it or not, that harvest dryness that we experienced, it's still down there. And we can see that both soil sampling estimates, Illinois State Water Survey, and then there's actually satellite and NASA-derived estimates as well, which are a good proxy over a larger area. And they're showing that same subsoil dryness. And that's not to say it's going to show its head as drought this year, but it's kind of a lack of a savings account going into the year. So if you think of a year like 2023, we had fantastic subsoil moisture beneath that quote unquote flash drought that we saw in 23. And, usually a drought of that caliber in 23, you start to see some tree and plant die off even around town. We didn't. We had that subsoil bank that we could withdraw from until that derecho, came through at the end of June and kind of kicked the door open. So we have less wiggle room this year because of that. I think with the forecast kind of looking at seasonal to wetter than average, I'm less concerned about Illinois proper. But that subsoil moisture drought has kind of turned into a snow drought as you go further north. So up near Chicago, at one point in January, Chicago had accumulated less snow than New Orleans.
Ooh.
I can confidently bet, my life savings that you're not going to see that another January in our lifetime. That's just very rare. And that kind of snow drought, if you will, extends from Chicago up to Minneapolis, extends across the Dakotas, even parts of Nebraska and western Iowa. And you mentioned it right at the beginning, that snow, when it gets established, percolates nicely into the soil when it melts in spring. It's not this big runoff event unless we have a huge warm up kind of in March or April. So we'll be watching for that. At least in central and southern Illinois, we actually got some decent snowfall. Here in January, we reached about average for a given year with some late snowfall there, parts of St. Louis, and then extending over into southern Indiana and Ohio. We've kind of been lacking that in recent years. I think some people are happy to finally get some, there are 2 or 3 real snow events to get outside and play in it and take pictures and do all that.
But not enough to take some of the drought concern away.
Right.
Yeah. And let me just clarify something you said. Up in Minnesota and Wisconsin, I know last winter, not this past winter, but they didn't get any snow either. So is that the same? Because I live kind of along the Mississippi River, and they're always worried about, flooding in the spring. And I don't think there's that worry again, unless I haven't been paying attention.
Yeah, no, we're not seeing that same flooding. If it's going to come about, it's going to be from new rainfall, not anything that's in hydrology now. So not a huge snowpack, not seeing kind of these huge ice dams that we've seen in years prior on the Missouri. So not that same sort of flooding concern. You could go back into the 90s, early 90s, some of the big floods that we saw there. But it's an interesting point, right? We hear, and there is some science behind this, kind of the more brutal winter tends to be kind of better for the crop year. And the reason's kind of what I just described. That would be the scientific connection, is more snow harsher winter, you get that nice free tillage in the winter, and then a new crop year with a bank of soil moisture. We're lacking that bank account this year in the upper Midwest, and part of that stretches into Illinois.
What about the freeze thaw in the ground? Has that? I know you said you put a soil sample in the other day, or you put a probe in the ground and you had to do some elbow grease. Is that thaw? Has the ground thawed, or is it there's still some moisture in there from that, or what does that look like?
Yeah, everything I was able to get down to was thawed yesterday. I was hitting some sort of pan around 18 inches. That may have been my weakness winning out, but it could have been something down there a little bit more frozen. We've been warming up pretty quickly. I know at least kind of in that top level, we're pretty much thawed out around the state. And I think that'll continue. It's been, with all these low pressure systems we've had, I mentioned the one last week, we've really had a parade of them now for a few weeks. We have tended to be on the warm side of them more often than not. If you go outside today, Tuesday, March 18th, if you go outside tomorrow, March 19th, before those storms come through, we've been warmer than average. And then the cold side of them, at least during March, has been pretty short. And then we're back to sunshine, wind, and we're evaporating soil moisture. So we've had decent rain. We've had regular rainfall. We're just zapping the moisture off in the next 48 hours. I mean, think about Sunday, Monday, Tuesday this week. There goes that top layer of moisture with the sun and the wind on top of it.
What about the spring outlook for temperature? What does that look like? I know we talked about precipitation side, but is it looking warmer or colder?
Yeah, so we've been enjoying this kind of warmer trend of late. I've been enjoying it, getting outside. Twin boys, they're 2 years old. I felt bad cooping them up inside all January, and we've been getting outside for walks and taking them in the backyard so they can explore everything. And I'd like that to continue selfishly. We're seeing some hints that, unfortunately, might not. So as we get into the end of March, I think parts of next work week will start cooler, and then they'll trend a little bit warmer at the end of the week going into the weekend based on some of the early forecasts right now. We're seeing this start to pop up with some of the long-range models that what we call kind of a dominant western U.S. ridge could set up either late March or early April. Now, we're getting out, I just put the disclaimer right at the beginning of this that you got to be cautious when you get out 10, 14 days in the forecast. But I'll say this. When that western ridge sets up this time of year, it can be sticky. And what I mean by that is it'll kind of break down here and there. We'll see systems try to sneak through it. But if it starts to reestablish itself, it can become dominant and it gets hard to move out of the way, especially if there's blocking support in the Pacific, a fancy term that we use to say that things are kind of stopped up in the atmosphere and not going to change too much. If I see that ridge look dominant and that start to come to fruition in some of these earlier model runs that come out over the next week, we could start April cooler. That would extend a frost freeze risk into early April. That would become an issue for planting in those decisions. And we could start the month cooler. Forecasting beyond that, I wouldn't be too confident in what we're going to see at the end of April, other than things trending right now a little bit wetter, which all else equal could mean a little bit warmer at the end of the month as well.
What am I seeing about this climate neutrality? Is that something to do with it? Or I haven't read much into it, but I'm seeing some comments on the climate being neutral. I'm not sure exactly what that means.
Yeah, so I'd say probably what that's speaking to is, I mentioned we've had this kind of parade of storm systems, and that's put us on this roller coaster of warm for a few days, cold front comes through, cold for a few days, and it's kept things moving. And that's what we like in agriculture. I mean, the Midwest, if you could sum up its weather, there's jokes all abounding. Things are always changing. That's what we do well. We can grow a crop pretty well. In fact, when you kind of put perfect weather over some of these physical simulations of crop growth, they don't actually do too well. They almost need the changing of the humidity. They need the rain on and then the rain off. They need sunshine and then days of cloudiness. And I think we've seen that in March. That's maybe where that neutral term is coming from. Kind of early hints are in April. We might be shifting into things slowing down a bit in the pattern. And that raises concerns because then we might be cold and wet for too long in April. And that's going to have an issue with planting. I'm not saying that's gospel right now, but it is an early hint that I'll be keeping an eye on.
And looking at El Nino or La Nina, what's going on there? I don't follow it too closely, but I know it's always a topic, and someone will say we're in one, and then we turn out to be another. Or La Nina's slowly going away. Like, it's kind of confusing at times.
Yeah, I love this. We're attacking all the big terms in one go. That's how we should do it. So yeah, La Nina, El Nino. I think the term was originally coined by Peruvian fishermen. So let's orient ourselves. We're off the west coast of South America, very rich and biomass there because that's where a lot of this cool water from the Pacific ends up. And fish and nutrients love this cool water. Mm. And so it's a very rich area for fishing. And they found that sometimes in December, that water quickly warmed up and their catches disappeared. So they weren't getting enough food and they're bringing back low catches in December. This tended to occur around Christmas. And they called this warm water as a result of the connection to Christmas, El Nino for the child or the Christ child. And they just noticed this connection when it gets warm in the west or the East Pacific, but west of Peru, they're going to have a low catch, and then their weather patterns would change in spring and summer after that. So it was something they started watching for. Now we know that this oceanic pattern, this warm water in the Central and Eastern Pacific, has a number of changes and impacts to our weather that we can actually correlate. There are some decent correlations with our weather. So El Nino is warm water in the Central and Eastern Pacific, right near the surface, sea surface temperatures. If we're the opposite of that, we're cooler than average, we're in a La Nina. So those are the two differences. The short and skinny on this, how it relates to Illinois weather, La Nina years, particularly in the summer following a La Nina event, we typically deal with more drought risk. It's not every year that those two line up, but more often than not, our big drought years from the past, we tended to see a La Nina before that coming out of winter. That's relevant for us now because this past winter, we had a La Nina event. Now it's weakened quickly, as it does in the new year. Through spring, it's probably weakened even a little bit quicker than some of us thought. We're heading out of a La Nina going into this growing season, but that's normal. We typically head out of a La Nina going into the growing season around plant, even in some of these kind of drought years. So it raises the drought level, some concern. It's not a home run. It's not to say every year that this has happened, we've had drought, but I would say it's highly likely that the reason we're talking about dust storms, the reason we're talking about Southern Plains drought, and maybe even some of the snow drought that we've mentioned already is connected in some way to La Nina and how that shapes the jet stream over winter.
Yeah, I hear lots of talk about it, but sometimes I get confused between the two. So I'm like, where are we? What are we doing? How does this factor in? But it kind of all makes sense when you paint the bigger picture. Anything else about the spring outlook that farmers should have on their radar? I know weather changes. The goal of these episodes is just to get a quick synopsis of what's happening here in Illinois weather-wise. And I know it'll change from month to month, but anything that farmers should have on their radar when it comes to spring, weather, climate, etc.
Yeah, I would say if you're like me at the end of last week, you're following the Weather Channel, the big names, whether it's Jim Cantori, there's storm chasers that are all over social media. Keep an eye on where they are for two reasons. One, we talked about these nighttime severe threats. Those are the ones that concern me in Illinois because they tend to increase threats to life and property for folks. So keep an eye on the severe weather reports this year. Things are trending. We've seen it start quickly that this could be, if we remain wet in April and that continues into May, the reality is a big budget of our rainfall in late spring and early summer comes in the form of thunderstorms. And if those are going to be severe as they can be, we need to be keeping an eye on that. Heat watches and warnings, have your phone charged. That's the first part of it. But keep an eye on where they're at. So if you see some of these, whatever this, whether it's Jim Cantori or other talking heads, if they're posted up in Illinois or Kentucky or in the Southeast like they have been, that probably harkens to a pattern that's supportive of more rain east of the Mississippi River, central and eastern Corn Belt. If you start seeing them posting up further west, they're out in Oklahoma City more traditionally, they're out in Amarillo or West Kansas, maybe even Colorado or into Nebraska, that means the moisture is starting to head further west. I'll be watching that to see in spring if we can get some moisture into that Southern Plains drought up into the upper Midwest as we get a little bit later in spring. That would be a way to work off some of those drought concerns. We could be wet here in Illinois through April and May and be sitting okay. But my big concern is what I mentioned earlier in that tweet, that upper Midwest and Northern Plains drought meeting up with the Southern Plains drought would make it much easier for that drought to expand into Illinois in June and July. Because if we're hot just to our west, if we're hot to our south, we source a lot of our air mass from there. We just saw that with the dust storm.
Yeah.
Air mass in the dust that was present in Oklahoma and Texas, and we brought it here. And we'll do that in summer if it remains hot and dry out there. So I'm not rooting for severe weather. That's not what I'm hoping for. But we do need rain, and one way to get rain is thunderstorms. And so if we see those finally start to percolate into the plains, we'll reduce the drought risk. If they stay over here in Columbus or they're down in Tuscaloosa, that drought's going to remain, and we'll see that.
That's probably the ultimate question. We need moisture, but is it worth the risk of severe storms? Hail, which we really didn't talk about. I mean, hail right now would just do damage to structures right now. I mean, they have started planting in southern Illinois. I have heard reports about that. So anything that pops out of the ground, obviously a risk to it. Some may come back. And you talk about wind. It would just be nice if we could get a couple days of just a slow, steady rain and not have everything else come with it. Wishful thinking, but
from your lips to God's ears.
Yeah, exactly. Matt, to wrap up, this is a two-part question. I like to share with people any weather apps or tools you talked about it a little bit. Any weather apps or tools you recommend for farmers to use. I always recommend the Radar Scope app. It does cost like, I don't know, it was $10 when I paid for it probably 10 years ago. Yeah. But my second part of that question, I heard just this morning that the European model is now using AI. So how does AI factor into all of this as well?
Yeah, that's a great question. Radar Scope is a fantastic app. It's what I use to track those storms overnight on Friday and then in the Southeast. I think it might still be $10. If it's not 10, it's maybe 15.
And that's just a one-time fee. You can go more premier, I think, if you want to, but
yeah,
$10.
A subscription, but you get all the bells and whistles mostly at $10. And I'm not affiliated anyway. It's just a great app. And I recommend that one. People, it's funny, in the meteorological community kind of criticize the iPhone app, but the reality is if you're just quickly trying to wake up in the morning and like plan a picnic in the afternoon and you want to generally know what the temperature is going to be and if there are rain chances, I'll admit, I will concede here, I occasionally use the iPhone app because it's just a fast way to get that number and a rain chance. Yeah. You can get a lot more technical with it. There's a lot of fun websites out there. Tropical Tidbits is one that has all sorts of bells and whistles of weather info and models that you could ever want. And it includes now the ECMWF AIFS, and that's the longest acronym you're going to use for a weather model here. But really, it's a new type of weather forecasting model that instead of using physics, which is how a lot of our models currently forecast the weather and have for the last 40, 50 years, uses a totally different AI model, a back end to forecast the weather. It doesn't know how the weather works. It's all what we call black box. We don't even know how this model works. It's the boogeyman of AI, but the reality is the model runs faster. It seems an early test to be more accurate. And while it's expensive computationally to train it, once it's trained, it's very cheap to run and to maintain. And right now, that ECMWF physical model, we have to wait 6 to 7 hours until we get that model released and made public to the rest of us. These new AI ones are coming out much quicker. There's just an announcement this week from the ECMWF, which has a lot of these state-of-the-art models, that they're going to a totally open source, free dissemination model in October of 25. And so that's great news for folks looking for better, more accurate forecasts at a time when, we're struggling, right, with some of the NOAA data concerns. I think that was finally some good news coming across the bow where our forecasts will be easier to get. They're going to be coming out faster and should be more accurate.
I was going to say, I think anytime that you can better predict weather and have it be accurate is great, but just don't put all your eggs in that basket. So we use other tools to help put things together. I mean, I know there's always that argument against AI. I think it can be used in good situations, and maybe the weather or climate could be one of them. But never, I always think never forget to look outside, just either, and see what's going on and observe. And I love it when people write things down for data collection of what's happening with the weather, because it's just so interesting to go back and look. Like we talk about the derecho back in 2020, 2023, like it's just a good reference and get kind of the bigger picture when you look back.
Yeah, absolutely. I'll say the best meteorologists that I've had the privilege of working with were observation obsessed. So they were almost more focused on what is happening and what has happened as what is going to happen. So that's a good lesson for life, right? Know where you are before you know where you're going, know where you have been, right? So there's parallels.
Definitely. Matt, anything else we didn't cover?
No, I think we got most of it. Tackled a lot of big names too.
Yeah. Thank you very much. We appreciate you having on the podcast.
Thanks so much, Kelsey.
Thanks for listening to the Field Advisor Podcast. Unbiased, independent agronomy information to keep your farm moving forward. I'm Kelsey Litchfield, your voice from the field. This podcast is funded by the Illinois Soybean Association Checkoff Program. Stay connected with Field Advisor on social media. Follow, like, and share to keep the conversation going. And don't forget to subscribe to the Field Advisor podcast on your favorite podcast platform.